In this lecture, we're going to be taking up the topic of the Catholic Reformation, or as some call it, the Counter-Reformation. And that's a question that hopefully we'll come back to by the end of the lecture, and you'll be able to answer. So I have a couple of essential questions, actually three. How and when did the Catholic Church respond to the challenge of the various reformers across Europe? What do the terms Catholic Reformation and Counter-Reformation signify? In which did the Catholic Church succeed, reform or counter-reform? So that will be what we want to be able to answer by the end of this lecture. So let's get going. Here's the context that I believe that's overlooked fairly often when we think about the Reformation and the geopolitical situation between the Europeans that are Christian, in particular the Habsburgs of Austria and Bohemia, who share a common border with the Ottoman Turks, led by Suleiman the Magnificent. And we know that Suleiman was fairly ambitious and fairly aggressive. And despite suffering setbacks such as the one in 1529 at Vienna, Suleiman came back. And in 1541, for example, he captures the Hungarian capital at Buda. And he's going to be a constant threat and constant menace to the Christian European territories. And this is going to involve both secular rulers, the Holy Roman Empire and various princes and other kings from other lands such as Poland and Lithuania, but also the popes, who are going to want to organize a modern-day crusade, if you will, in the 16th century, to put an end to the Turkish invasions and advances. So that's something that we need to keep in the back of our minds as we think about the overall Catholic Reformation. Now, it's true that there were many in the Catholic Church that took up the cause of reform, that this is not something that just comes about after or in response to, really, Luther. In 1524, for example, St. Cajetan, who's pictured there in a black robe and a Bible and a white flower, founded the order known as the Theatines. And this order was an attempt to train reform-minded people, especially reform-minded priests in the hierarchy, the higher-ups in the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, to be more spiritual and to be better people and to lead lives of austerity. So the criticism that the Theatines had was, I think, probably very similar to the criticism Martin Luther had and others of the Roman Church: excessive, lavish attention to money, to buildings, to art, and to exterior things in the world, material things, that is. So we can go on to these three examples of early church reformers, and those are the Somaschi, the Urusilines, and St.Theresa of Avila. So, and that is three orders. So the Somaschi were founded by Girolamo Emiliani in 1528. And he opened a series of orphanages in the Italian peninsula to provide relief to those that suffered the effects of the constant warfare between France and Spain over who really controlled the Italian peninsula. So that's one of the things that he did. He also began to minister to the sick people in and around Venice, where he was from, and that spread throughout the Italian peninsula. And he and his movement really tried to focus on spiritual affairs and to repair the physical damage that war had done to the Italian people. And so he deserves credit. And we see that the Ursulines, founded by Saint Angela Merici in 1535, and she was a follower of St. Francis, that 12th century figure who gave up all of his worldly possessions and wealth and strapped on a pair of sandals and wandered the earth, trying to provide relief and help to all he encountered. And that's going to be very much the guiding mission of the Ursulines: deep mystical gifts to serve the poor and the needy. We also see St. Theresa of Avila from Spain. She was a mystic who developed ritualized prayer practices and wrote books about how to actually pray, and you can see her there writing a book. She's also been pierced in the heart by the arrow of Christ, that is, Christ's love so consumed her. It was like kind of that idea of Cupid shooting his arrow. And instead, this time it's not Eros, the God of love, but the idea of Christian love through Christ. So there is evidence that there were a number of people at the grassroots level that wanted to take on the question of reform of the Catholic Church to bring it back to its original mission, and that goes all the way back to the days of Christ, the apostles, and the early church. So in that way, these reformers are, in a sense, like humanists, that they want to go back to the original church, as humanists wanted to go back to the original pagan sources to find avenues of truth and how to live a good life. These reformers want to go back to the early church. And I think that's something that these Catholic reformers share, ironically, with Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin, who want to go back to a more primitive, earlier church. So moving on, we're going to look at St. Ignatius of Loyola, who founded the Society of Jesus, today known as the Jesuits in short. He began sometime around 1534 in Paris, and by 1540 Pope Paul III approved the order, and the order quickly grew from a very few founding members to over 15,000 members scattered throughout the world. And the Jesuits are going to accompany the trading missions of the Portuguese into India, China, and Japan, and the overseas trading missions and colonizing missions of the Spanish to the areas of the New World. And you can see there Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., one of the great Jesuit institutions in the United States today, for both Catholics and non-Catholics alike, I would add. So the idea of the Jesuits was a life of poverty, chastity, obedience, and in particular, obedience to the person of the Pope. They also believed that long years of study were necessary in order to become a priest. One of the great criticisms of priests in the Renaissance times was that they were ignorant, not well trained, not well read, not well versed, and they were too preoccupied with worldly affairs. And so St. Ignatius is going to actually propose that no one become a priest before the age of 33, which would give a person, an individual, number of years to study and to write and to think. So these Jesuits are really had a reputation as teachers and scholars, and they were actually feared by Protestants because the Protestants recognized the Jesuits for their learning, their debating abilities, and their good moral way of living. So they really are going to work in the service of the church to stop the Reformation. So here we see that idea of counter-Reformation that I introduced in one of the essential questions. So Ignatius himself was a former soldier. He fought on behalf of the Spanish. He's wounded in war fighting the French. And while he was convalescing, he had this conversion experience and decided that he would serve the church and the Pope in particular as a soldier of Christ. He wrote a guidebook. And again, we see a lot of writing going on. And again, I think the influence of humanism and the idea of literacy and the printing press is very present here too. And his book was called Spiritual Exercises. And what's really interesting about this book is that he writes that it's very possible for individuals to take control of their lives and shape their destinies, which sounds an awful lot like Pico, by becoming a new person. But in St. Ignatius's world, a new person meant that one was dedicated to the teachings and examples of Christ. So in some ways, maybe Ignatius connects to Erasmus, the Prince of Humanists, the great Christian humanist in this sense. So like Pico, in his idea that human beings have the ability to shape their destiny, that is, they have agency and they have the free will, something that Luther, Calvin, Zwingli deny completely. So this is really kind of an interesting contrast, and I think that's why we want to bring him up. And the Jesuits established a series of schools throughout Europe and then in the New World and wherever they were, and they were actually able to win back Protestants and reconvert Protestants to the Catholic faith. So I think this is a really interesting story. Now, we're going to look at the Roman Inquisition that was brought back in 1542 by the popes as well to purify the church. Remember that all Protestants, whether they be Lutheran or followers of Zwingli or later followers of Calvin, were considered heretics by the church and therefore hunted down, and when apprehended or when they could be apprehended, That is, if they didn't have the protection of a political prince who had a great deal of power and influence, they could be brought before this court and they could be tortured into giving up confessions and recanting their Protestant ways. So the church is seemingly in 1542 taking a hard line against the Protestant movement, yet that hard line is going to soften very quickly with Paul III, who instituted the Inquisition, but again, because of the Turkish threat and because of the ongoing struggles that different princes and the Holy Roman Empire were facing with the advance of the Protestant groups, he decides that he's going to call a council called the Council of Trent to deal with the church questions of reform. Now, to be fair, Pope Paul III was aware that things weren't going all that well for the Catholic Church, and in the 1530s, 1536-37 to be precise, he commissioned a study of the Catholic Church and its problems, very much based on the ideas that the reformers had been talking about. And the report that was issued by a group of Catholic theologians led by Caspar Contarini really found a lot of problems within the church, and they issued this document, Concilium de Emendenda Ecclesia, translated from Latin into English, the plan for fixing the church. This report is very critical of church practices, of popes, of the attention to worldly possessions, art, buildings, parties, popes having children, priests having children, which they're not supposed to do. And so Paul decides that he's going to hold on to this report and bury it. Something we hear a lot about with emails today, possibly, right? But yet the printing press made it possible to print this document. A copy of this document found its way out of the Vatican up to the German lands, into Luther's hands, and lo and behold, Luther decides to publish it and print it and distribute it, thus causing a great deal of embarrassment for the church in the early 1540s. And that, combined with the Turkish threat and the need to have all princes on board with stopping the Turks, Pope Paul III decides to call a council. And here you see Luther and the Turks. This is Suleiman the Magnificent on the right. So there was a call for a general council to meet, and that call for a general council was going to include Lutherans as well. So that the Pope Paul III really saw this as an opportunity and a moment to really bring the idea of Christian unity back, and that he invites the Lutherans, though the Lutherans have certain issues that do not allow them really to participate. In other words, the Lutherans say, look, if you want us to participate in this conversation about bringing about Christian unity in Europe, the Pope can't be the head of this council, and they had certain demands that obviously the Pope could not concede to. So we're not going to see Lutherans. So we're going to see a group of Catholic theologians and bishops from across Europe come together in this town of Trent, which you see shown in red on the right-hand side. Now, the town of Trent is outside the papal territory, so it's not a papal town, but it is an imperial territory, so it's under the control of Charles V. And he wanted it in a territory that he could control. Now, Charles really wanted to talk more about practical matters within the church, the idea of selling offices, that was wrong, the idea of selling indulgences, that was wrong. Charles really didn't want to get into anything too heavy in terms of theology. However, the French king, long a thorn in the side of Charles V, really wanted to talk about theological issues. So we see that the European leaders here are, in fact, divided. It's also worth mentioning that the same French king, Francois I, also struck a political diplomatic alliance with the Turks, who are Muslim, in order to cause trouble for Charles V. So the idea of this council meeting is really quite remarkable, because there was a lot of political instability, there was a lot of infighting among the actual Catholic leaders of Europe, yet this council takes off. Now, it's going to meet in 3 sessions. 1545 to 1546 is the first session. Then we're going to go to Pope Julius III in 1551, and then finally we're going to go to the last and final session led by Pope Pius IV, 1562 and 63. So it meets intermittently over a period of 18 years, and it takes up rather important questions. But at the end of the day, what you see here listed on the screen are the conclusions of the church, and I've decided to actually type them up there so that you can kind of stop the lecture, read them, and you can see what the church actually does. It makes no concessions to the Lutheran or the Calvinist or the Zwingli positions or the Anabaptist positions. So it's going to maintain intact all of the teachings of the Catholic Church going back for centuries. And with that, I'll stop here, take any questions, and we'll start